Well, how's it going, everybody, and welcome back to Tyler's Real Fishing. On this video, we're going to dive into the topic of finesse fishing versus reaction bait fishing and when you should utilize and implement those two different types of fishing on your bodies of water. You know, there are so many different ways to catch bass, and so it can get very confusing at times, but I want to make this video as simple as possible by comparing and contrasting the differences between the finesse category of lures and the reaction style by looking at 3 different fishing scenarios that I think can apply to you no matter where you live. So as always, my name is Tyler Anderson, and let's talk about it. Well, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Tyler, as I mentioned, and I make it my goal on this channel to help you guys become better bass anglers and, of course, catch not only more fish than you ever have, but your biggest bass ever, no matter where you live in the country. And, of course, I like to say at the beginning of every few videos that I don't know everything about bass fishing, but in all of my travels across the country the past 6 to 8 years of my life, I have learned a ton, and I've fished with a lot of people that have given me a lot of knowledge and experience that I love passing along to you guys. So strap in, because we have a ton of information to cover today. One of my favorite things to do on this channel is to teach you guys kind of high in the sky, conceptual level things about your fisheries that can, of course, give you guys more understanding on how to catch more fish in your fisheries. So I remember when I was first beginning my bass fishing journey, I would show up to a pond or a lake, whether it was new or one that I'd been to before, with this preconceived notion of I can catch fish on XYZ lures, doing XYZ patterns, and oftentimes that wouldn't work out for me. And I didn't really understand why, and I think looking back on it, it was because I didn't understand the big terms when it comes to what my body of water is like, what the structure, the cover, the water clarity, what all of that stuff means in terms of picking the lures to throw. I know I made a video a few months ago, I'll have it linked up in the corner as well as down below, about how to pick lures based on weather conditions. Today's video is going to be how to pick lures between the finesse category and the moving baits category, or the reaction baits category, depending on the cover and structure you have on your bank. That way you can have the most efficient fishing day possible, which means, of course, catching fish, but also not getting snagged and losing lures, as we'll talk about with some of these categories in some of these situations. So situation number 1 we're going to talk about is going to be your standard bank. Now, what I mean by normal bank is I'm talking about any sort of average bank you guys would have in your pond or your lake. Now, I guess I didn't really talk about it before I got to this moment, but this video is really going to be about the bank beaters. I'm not talking about offshore situations. I'm talking about my top 3 shore fishing situations for you guys that fish on the bank, fish kayaks, or fish a bass boat, and you're just not confident enough to fish offshore. There are still plenty of bass to catch up shallow on the bank. So bank situation number 1 is just your general bank. It can have gravel, it can have small rocks, it can have a grass line, it can have no grass, heck, it can be just straight mud. And your standard bank could also have some kind of structure lining the bank. So it could be some stumps, it could be a dock, it could be some reeds or shoreline grass. There's really a whole lot of things that make this category pretty dang broad, but that's why I wanted to cover it first. And so when picking the lures from the finesse category or the reaction baits category, the first thing I need to know is the water clarity. Is the water dirty or is it clean? And in today's situation, the water is very, very clean. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw lures that are more natural colored. I have a video, I'll have it linked below as well. Now, I understand there may be some of you that are confused right now between the difference of finesse fishing and reaction bait. You may be new to bass fishing and may be thinking, what the heck do those two terms mean? I think I have 2 videos, at least I have one that I just released a few days ago about what finesse fishing is. I will have it linked below as well as in the corner right here. But they are basically the 2 polar opposites when it comes to how to retrieve your lure and how it's presented in the water. So finesse, usually smaller, it is more intricate, finely detailed, smaller lures, usually thrown on a spinning rod, and the focus on those is mostly on the natural colors. Reaction baits, those are thrown to cover water. You are chunking and winding that thing back in. That's things like a spinnerbait, a crankbait, a chatterbait that don't necessarily catch those fish that are cold and finicky and just don't really want to feed on something fast, don't really want to chase. The reaction bait is a chase fishing lure. Finesse baits are for fish that do not want to chase. So in these two categories, what lures would I choose for your standard bank? Well, because it's so broad, I can't really give you a distinct answer, but I can tell you that generally these banks are going to be more shallow and generally have more things to get stuck on, whether it's leaves on the bottom or sticks or a grass line. So usually lures that have exposed hooks on either category are not ones that I choose very often, besides a few on the reaction bait. So we're gonna start on the finesse category. When you know your fish are a cold front just blew in, you have high pressure, and those fish don't really want to chase, you're going to want to go with the finesse category. So for your standard, pond fishing banks, I love throwing a standard 5-inch weightless Texas Rig Senko. You can make the argument that a Texas Rig Senko is not a finesse lure, but I think when it comes to rigging it weightless, and especially rigging it wacky rigged, that is definitely in the finesse category. The other finesse lure that I would choose for your kind of shallow general pond scenario is going to be the shaky head. I think the shaky head, because it is weedless, is going to be better for those situations. I don't really throw a Ned rig on those regular banks. I'll throw a Ned rig on some other banks that I'll talk about here in a second, but when it comes to the drop shot, the Ned rig, the spy bait, a lot of those things I don't really throw on the standard banks, because oftentimes on those, at least in ponds, the water is relatively dirtier than it is in a big, clear, deep lake like this is. And so, sorry if this is kind of confusing. I wanted to make this as concise as possible, but I understand that this first topic of the general bank tends to be confusing. Now, when it comes to the situation I'm fishing today, I had pretty clear water with a grass line, and so I'm gonna throw something when it comes to the reaction bait category if I have a little bit of wind, and it's gonna be something like a chatterbait or a spinnerbait, and then also a swimming worm. I would kind of categorize that in the reaction bait category. But in this category, it's really up to you what you want to throw. So I don't want to talk about this one a whole lot longer. I'm going to get to more niche situations. And situation number 2 when it comes to selecting your lures is going to be wood. So when talking about a bank that has wood, I'm talking about either standing timber, as you saw in that drone shot, or lay down timber. So when it comes to wood, I like to go with what I call like a mega finesse category. So it's gonna be my more weightless soft plastics, gonna be my bigger worms, my oftentimes heavy jigs that I wouldn't necessarily call them reaction baits, but they're also not finesse. So they're kind of somewhere in the middle. If I want to get my lure up into those trees near them, but not move it very fast, that is generally what I go to when those fish are pressured. But around wood, I love throwing reaction baits. And of course, when the reaction bait category is wide open for the first category, it is not quite wide open for wood. Of course, around standing timber and especially laydowns, it is hard to throw a crankbait. I'm not saying it can't be done. I have seen guys, especially like Patrick Walters at Lake Fork this past week, he threw a deep diving jerkbait around trees using his live scope to watch the lure for the entirety of the cast. That is definitely kind of a very high skill level sort of fishing when you're fishing a treble hooked bait around wood. So for a lot of you guys that are just beginning, you don't have a whole lot of money to spend on tackle, I would highly recommend staying away from treble hooks when it comes to wood of any kind. I don't care if it's a topwater popper or a spook, it's just getting your treble hooks around wood is just an accident waiting to happen. So I like to throw a frog around shallow wood. I like to throw Texas rig swim bait around shallow wood, and I love throwing a spinnerbait around shallow wood. Those are kind of my go-tos for the reaction bait side of things around wood. And one thing to keep in mind with both throwing the middle finesse to also reaction baits around wood is that you may be fishing things that you can see. So trees, like in that drone shot, and maybe I'll show it here again, trees that you can see sticking out of the water. But there is 100% of the time gonna be more cover than you can see underneath the water. So if it's clear water like I have today, I can actually physically see the trees underwater. But a lot of the times with dirty water, you will not be able to see those trees unless they are sticking out of the water. So don't just target the areas where you see the visual cover sticking out of the water. Try to target the entirety of the area, because I guarantee you there's going to be fish sitting on trees farther down in the water column than you think are there. So that is it for scenario number 2, wood. My scenario number 3 is the last one I'm going to talk about, and it's going to be rocks. A rocky bank, I think, definitely applies to you guys that fish in big lakes more than it is in ponds. I have not found many ponds besides Corey ponds that actually have rocks like the ones that I'm power poled on right now and filming next to. So of course, if you guys are pond guys, still stay tuned, because I think you can learn some things about rocks that you may find in some ponds you visit. But most of the time, these tips here are going to be for lake guys. Now, when it comes to this situation, you are basically as wide open with lure selection as you were in the shallow general bank. but I still like to throw certain ones more than others on rock. And starting with the finesse category, you are basically wide open on whatever you want to throw. So if I'm wide open, I'm gonna throw a Ned rig and a shaky head almost all the time. And if I see any fish sitting down there on the bottom that are willing, that are suspended a little bit up, I'm gonna throw the drop shot. I have found that bass around rocks either suspend way off the bottom or they sit, sunk down to the bottom. And so a wacky rig for me around rocks, a rocky bank, whether it's shallow or deep like this bluff here, I have not really found a wacky rig to be effective. I feel like you're kind of wasting time. I think a wacky rig is more of a grass line, structure and cover oriented thing where you're making more target casts with it. I think on a rocky bank, you're gonna waste a lot of time on a wacky rig. So I wanna get my lure down there, I wanna hop it off the bottom, get it back in and make another cast. That's what I have in my finesse fishing category for rocks. It's more the Ned rig, shaky head, drop shot, and of course, if fish are feeding on bait fish, the small little minnow imitations. And when it comes to reaction baits on rocks, I've made videos about this before, you want your lures to be hitting on the bottom unless of course those fish are suspended. And so I'm gonna throw a crankbait almost all the time. At least I'm always gonna have one rigged up on my boat when I know I'm fishing a rocky situation, or at least have the potential to fish a rocky situation. Crankbait, I just think is the best for rocks. It hardly ever gets stuck. When you do get stuck, you just troll over there or kayak over there, pluck your line and the crankbait will pop right off. I don't really have a whole lot of luck with spinnerbaits or chatterbaits on rock unless it's really shallow, like up in Minnesota this summer. I fished a little rock vein on a small lake with a chatterbait and was able to catch some smallmouth bass and a few largemouth on that chatterbait. But most of the time on these highland reservoir lakes where the water is deep and clear and you got tons of rock, I just don't throw the chatterbait a whole lot. I think the crankbait is one of the best options to go because it gets that lure down where those fish are into the strike zone for the maximum amount of time. And in my experience, I just think if those fish are going to feed on something, they want it deflecting off those rocks in terms of the fish that are going to, chase and hit a reaction bait. I think a crankbait is really the best way to go. Again, if you guys did not listen to my instructions at the beginning of the video, I have videos about both reaction baits and what the category of finesse baits are. And so I'll leave those linked down in the description below. That way you guys are not confused about those two terms. So I hope this video helped you guys understand a little more about what type of lures you want to choose in these scenarios. Again, there are so many different types of bass fishing situations out there. That's why I love making these videos, is because the more I travel, the more lakes I go to, the more ponds I go to, the more situations I see that I can explain to you guys how to catch fish in those. And so I understand if this video was a little bit general, but I just wanted to help you guys, again, make your decisions. That way you're not showing up to the pond that has tons of shallow wood and you're getting ready to throw a drop shot or a Ned rig, or you get to a rocky situation and expect to catch your fish on a wacky rig because you were catching them on your general shallow bank the other day. You're not gonna do it on rocks, and I wanna help you guys make those decisions. I'll see you guys in the next episode of TRF.